I want to do the same thing that the Europeans got. I want to make sure that the African refugees are also, or the Middle Easterns and what have you, are coming to the United States today, are also being captured professionally and with an archive mindset.
Hello, and welcome to Art Restart, where we explore how artists are reinventing their fields and building a new landscape for the arts. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, which is brought to you by the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be speaking with photographer and documentary filmmaker Tariq Tarey. The son of a Somali diplomat, Tariq was born in Mogadishu but spent his childhood in several countries in the Middle East as well as in India. When civil war broke out in his homeland, though, he and his family were forced to become refugees. Eventually, in the mid-90s, they were resettled by the U.S. government in Columbus, Ohio, where Tariq continues to live and work today. Tariq's experience as a refugee led him to beat an impactful professional and artistic path for himself. Ever since he purchased his first camera, a Canon AE1 in 2002, he has captured thousands of portraits of refugees from around the world, concentrating particularly on those like him whom the U.S. government resettled in central Ohio. They include fellow Somalis as well as arrivals from a myriad locations around the globe, from Nepal and Iraq to the Democratic Republic of Congo and more recently, Ukraine. Tariq has also directed documentary films including Women, War and Resettlement, Nasro's Journey, and Silsilad, which have been featured on PBS, and most recently The Darien Gap, which was showcased at the Second United States Conference on African Immigrant and Refugee Health. His photos have been exhibited in several institutions, including the Ross Museum and Wright State University, and several are now part of the permanent collection at the Columbus Museum of Art. His deep knowledge of the refugee experience stems not only from his own personal experience. For years now, he's also worked as the Director of Refugee Social Services at Jewish Family Services in Columbus, Ohio. I started off our talk by asking him to describe what made him want to buy that first Canon AE1 22 years ago.
Honestly, my father was not a photographer. My grandfather was not an artist. None of my lineage has any art based. But I just had this feeling you know what? I just love seeing beautiful photographs, right? And I didn't know what beautiful photograph even was. I just loved the idea of capturing something. So fast forward a few months after I spent many, many, many dollars of underexposed film at Walgreens. There's a street in Columbus called High Street, and within that there was a camera store called Midwest Photo Exchange. And there was a young man who was working there who was Somali, and his name is Abdi Roble. And that name and that person changed the way in which I view photography. And because of him, I realized the power of photography. He is a self-taught photographer from Somalia, same history as me. Left Somalia when he was a kid, came to the US as either student or something like that. Things didn't work out. The Civil War breaks. He ends up in the United States. And all of a sudden, he's working at a camera store. And to me, when I looked at a photographer, right? When I look at a photographer, I'm thinking about somebody who is National Geographic, white guy, you know what I mean? That's the sort of the idol that you're looking at. But to see a young Somali man working at a camera store sponsored by Leica, and if you don't know what Leica is the German camera manufacturer that is sought out for around the world. Leica sponsors him, and he travels to Cuba in the early 2000s, and he's got this exhibit. And I'm thinking, you're Somali. You're not supposed to have all of this. This is a white guy territory, right? So he took me under his wing and learned the craft from a wide variety of other photographers. And to me, I feel like the other thing that made me realize the power of photography is also where I worked as a professional. So I'm a director of a refugee program, large refugee program at an agency called Jewish Family Services. And that itself, seeing the history of Holocaust and seeing the history of, from the eyes of the Jewish people throughout the Second World War, and the importance of capturing photos, and also people arriving into the United States from Europe to Ellis Island, that is where the dots are being connected for me, saying, okay, I need to do something with my thing that I've learned and the skill that I've gained. It is about making sure that the people who are arriving today, who look like me, need to be also archived and made sure that their history is also preserved, and not through Snapchat and Facebook and, all this like phone photos, but a respected sort of Gordon Parks style of photography, black and white. I want to do the same thing that the Europeans got. I want to make sure that the African refugees are also, or the Middle Easterns and what have you, are coming to the United States today, are also being captured professionally and with an archive mindset.
How did you develop your practice of approaching your subjects to start with? Because so many of these subjects, I imagine, are very vulnerable. I'm guessing they're fairly new arrivals to the country. And, you mentioned National Geographic. It is so easy to exploit people who are in a very vulnerable position to tell a story that's foreign to Americans. You don't do that. But how did you develop your code of conduct, I guess, is what I'm asking.
It really is a common sense code of conduct, because I am telling my story in some sense, right? So leaving my country, not because of my choice, we have in common. Learning a new language, we have that in common. Being confused all the time, we have that in common. Finding Americans as fast walking, fast talking people, we have that in common. So I have a lot of common, no matter if they are from Afghanistan, if they are from Sierra Leone, if they're from Somalia, right? So at least they know I come in peace. So my code of conduct is not to pressure anyone to sit in front of my camera. My code of conduct is to respect the person. At any time they decided not to be part of my work, I'm good. Absolutely. No money exchange between us. So I'm not going to pay you, because then it dilutes the whole system. So there's a lot of journalistic ethics with the code of conduct. It's sort of like morphed into that, but it's also common sense. And also there are studio photos, but there's also outdoor photos. Outdoor photos is when I am in the neighborhood, I've been invited to an event or party, right? So I set up my backdrop and people come by.
And you've also traveled abroad for your photography, is that right?
Yes, many refugee camps from Africa to Europe to Panama as well.
At this point in your work with Jewish Family Services, you've worked with so many different populations. So you've become an expert in the challenges that refugees face coming from all over the globe. But do you have to prepare yourself for each shoot, particularly if you're going to photograph someone from a culture that you're less familiar with?
So remember the beginning of our conversation, I told you the many places I lived in.
Yeah.
Including India, actually. So there's a lot of that comes to big play, right? So when do you make an eye contact? When do you shake hands? When don't you shake hands? What does a trustworthy body, like impressions of your face, how do you convince somebody to sit for you? Like all these things are ingrained in me without me pretending to learn or to do that. So Iraqis and Syrians have similar culture. We Somalis have similar culture, so I know when to use that. I lived as a child in India, so I have that, understanding of if I'm photographing a Bhutanese Nepali or Nepali refugees here in Columbus, I do know a few words in Hindi. I don't know the Hindi customs. So there's a lot of that not only from a technical point of view, but as a human level, I do know when not to step on a bad situation or not to set somebody off by saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, right? But from a technical point, how do I prepare myself? It really is depending on the project itself. Sometimes I would photograph on a large format, like a 4x5 film camera, or sometimes I want to be nimble and quick. I would have my medium format, either Mamiya 6.7. So it depends on where I'm at. If I'm in
And
the studio,
always film, yes?
yeah. So for the larger projects, for the long-term project, it is 99% on a large format 4x5 field camera. Accompanied with that also is I use extensively Mamiya 6.7 or Pentax 6.7. So those are sort of the quicker. I'm in a refugee camp. I can't set up for a long time. I want to be quick, but also it's a large enough negative that I could print larger work.
I heard you saying, I think in an interview, that one of the reasons why you prefer film, or you hinted at this, is that you, in terms of archiving purposes, you have more faith in a negative than you do digital information. Or am I making that up?
No, you're not making that up. Yes, I've said
Okay.
it, and most people are sick of me saying it all the time. But listen to this. Do you remember floppy disk?
Yeah, sure.
What happened to it?
Yeah.
Exactly my point, right? So there's always, yes, we can copy things to a newer medium and newer things, but even the FireWire on your Mac, like just 10, 15 years ago, like what happened to it? The technology is changing so fast that we cannot keep up with it. And like, I have mini DVs, right? Remember those mini DVs that we used to like film our family and just like, I have a bunch of that on my kid's birth. And now the other day I wanted to convert it into to put it in my hard drive in my server. Pierre, I'm telling you, I was having a tough time, man. I was like, I had to connect a cable to another cable to another cable. I had to get a new
And they're
camera.
not that old.
And they're not even that old. My kid is like 17 years old. So like, forget it, right? So, but American Civil War, 1865, you can still print those right now, today. All you need is a chemical, all you need is a one light bulb, and you're good to go. So the point I'm making is, yeah, you can shoot the most fanciest digital, and good for you. I support you, but let me be happy with what I have. I know my wife says I'm very grumpy all the time, but you know what I mean? Just life is good.
You talked about you're wanting your photos, your images to be accessible to a broad range of people. I wonder if you could talk about how your subjects react to seeing themselves in an exhibition of yours.
That's a good question. When I'm photographing them at first, they're like, Tariq, why do you find me interesting? Like, what's so interesting about me? What, like, you have like 500 refugees that you could photograph. What is it about me? So to answer that question, I'm like, because you're unique and you're different, we're all different, right? So yes, we may have the shared experience, but not all of us went through the same process. I want to learn more about you.
You've learned so much about refugees through your work and through your experience. What do you think you've learned through your artistic project about refugees that you wouldn't have learned had you not started taking photos, if you were just working at Jewish Family Services?
I think we in World War II, we said never again. In Cambodia happened in the 70s. And then Bosnia happened after that. And then Rwanda. And then the one that surprised me the most, once the world learned everything about genocide and how bad it is, you have the Yazidis. Mm-hmm. Through ISIS, they have been, that's the 21st century genocide, right? So if I wasn't involved in refugee resettlement and refugee welcoming refugees and refugee policies and figuring out things. And if I was not a photographer, I don't think I would have paid attention as much as to what's happening in the world. So it's sort of an obsession. It's sort of a healing for me through my past is what I've gone through and what most refugees have gone through. It's, to me, I feel like this is therapy to help refugees as much as I can, because it's my story. It is who I am. It is what identifies me as a person, is somebody who lost his country, who came to the West using the tools of the West to help whoever I can, who's gone through the same processes or the same historical situations that have happened. I want to be the bridge. I want to be the conduit. I want to be the person that brings that dialogue and discussion through art, because everybody likes to go to an exhibit, right? Art exhibit or photo exhibit. So if the dialogue is about learning from one another, I'm doing my job, and I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
In our front pages, we're seeing a lot of photos of refugees or immigrants who are trying to come to the country. What are your eyes? What are we seeing in these photos? They're taken by very good photographers, but they're selected by editors. When you look at what's being shown to us, what do you think we're not seeing?
Yeah, we're not seeing many things, but let me go back to if I can help the listeners first, right? So the idea is, historically, the difference between a refugee and an immigrant, it's a defined law, an international law that was set in 1951 called the Geneva Convention, right? So the idea was any person who's being persecuted based on their religion, based on their ethnicity, based on the political affiliation, based on their even sexuality. If persons being persecuted or harmed, they are allowed to leave that country, their birth country or the country that's doing that to them, and apply for a refugee asylum to say, hey, if I go back, I will be killed. Please help me. We, as Americans, signed on to that law, signed on to that agreement. So if somebody comes to the border legally and says, hey, I'm a refugee, I need your help, we have to listen to them. So closing the border itself based on either political or you want to score political points, that is besides the point. We as Americans have signed on to that, whether you're Democrat or Republican, whether you're different liberal or conservative, we signed on to that in 1950s, helping the European refugees were coming to the United States at the time, right? Now that that's not happening, we also need to open our hearts and really figure that out. So I just want to clearly say that.
Yeah, thank you.
Before I answer your question. So what are we not seeing is the human story to it. So what drove that Honduran woman, that Venezuelan young mother with her 2 children, what drove her from this entire continent all the way to Texas, that she was photographed and all you see is a name, maybe, and the location of that photo was taken, and the editor talks or the writer talks about the general story. But what's missing is she's a daughter of somebody. She's a person that walked for thousands of miles, probably most likely sexually violated. What's her case? Why did she leave the place? That's really what's missing from the context of it. And as an American, and all of us as Americans, what's happening in their country that they find is so hell that they're leaving? And what could our country do to help them stay in their country, build it, support it? Because you've heard the Marshall Plan, right? After World War II. What do we do with Germany right after World War II? We put every single resource we can to give support to that country. And are you saying that Honduras cannot be Germany? What's the difference?
I'm going to ask you an unfair question because it's
Sure.
impossible to answer. But if you were granted 2 minutes in front of Congress, what's one step they could take, give that you must know, given all your work, to make the whole situation on the southern border easier? What are they ignoring? What would you tell them in those 2 minutes?
It's very difficult to give you only 2 minutes, right?
Yeah, I know.
But let's separate. I would separate facts from fiction. The fact is, we as Americans, what makes this country what it is because, truthfully, and I'm saying this because of the diversity and the respect of the Constitution and the laws that we have on our books. We said we will protect human beings who are suffering from tyranny and oppression and persecution. We said that, and we signed on to it. Second is, we also need to look at what is fueling people to come to the United States and why are those countries broken down, and could we look into it? And obviously, you're only giving me 2 minutes, but I would definitely focus on not to politicize this situation. It doesn't have to be.
Your job as a refugee resettlement expert or counselor is so closely related to your artistic practice. So you hear it must be incredibly stressful. You hear a lot of trauma in your daily life. Do you have an artistic practice that's completely unrelated to refugees? Do you have a way you recharge artistically that's not connected to those stories?
Yes, but it is still photography, but it's not focused on refugees. So I'm working on a project about Cuba. I find Cuba fascinating, and it reminds me of my childhood quite a bit, actually, every time that I visit. I've been there many times now. I'm working on a project about how race and ethnicity from a capitalist society like the United States. I do understand it because I live here. I lived here most of my life. So I do understand race relations in a capitalist society, but I don't understand it from race relations in the commonest sense, right? So I'm exploring what that looks like. Like I said, I've been there like many, many times, and I've been doing portraiture about people's different looks, Spaniards, mulattoes, and negros, and all these. They have this different, like they wouldn't even call me like black. They would say I'm somewhat mixed, which I am thinking to myself, dude, I am African. I have no white in me, period. So I'm curious about how race, like, you and I know slavery, Civil War, Jim Crow, civil rights, and so forth and so on, redlining. Like there's so many things that you and I know about the United States race relations. But what does race relations look like in the communist society? Are they all equal like the way they say it? Or are they not? So if you ask me what other art, it's still photography, but it's not related to the documentary stuff that I do with my refugee work. It's about really learning. And also it gives me a chance to take my camera and travel to another country and just learn about the culture. And it really is fascinating, by the way. Have you been to Cuba?
I have not, and I'm surprised because I know after the previous administration, it got more difficult to go. How have you been able to go so often?
Yeah, it's very tricky, right? But if you when you go in, and genuinely I mean it, I'm going to support the Cuban people. So you could go and support the Cuban people. You're not economically influencing. You're not buying anything from there. You're just supporting the Cuban people by, either renting a place, supporting them, like, buying things, supporting them in any way possible. So you're able to do that. But it could be closed tomorrow. So by the time this podcast gets released, who knows what could happen.
If you'd like to learn more about Tariq and see a few of his gorgeous photographs, please head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. Be sure to subscribe or to follow the podcast wherever you listen so you'll know as soon as our next interview is published. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Pier Carlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts, thank you for listening.